Hello and welcome to our third and final video notes for Unit 4 on Imperialism, where we talk about the end of the First World War and the United States move to an isolationist policy and kind of society, really, and what was fueling that. So we'll go ahead and get started. So we've got quite a few objectives. More so just kind of explaining this, you need to understand more about the result of World War I, more so than what actually happened in World War I, even the causes, right? You need to know the results and what kind of came from the First World War. So you got to be able to define isolationism. What is that? You got to be able to explain why the United States did not join the League of Nations, even though it was proposed by the United States President. Got to be able to cite the terms of the Calais-Brand Pact, and then describe ways the U.S. sought to limit its involvement in international affairs, which is kind of part of that isolationism. And then finally draw connections between World War I and the post-war U.S. isolationism. So again, a lot to do with that isolationist reaction to World War I on the part of the United States. So it's November 11th, 1918, and World War I ends. An armistice is signed. This is an agreement to stop fighting. Okay, so the armistice is the agreement. The treaty, which is what we normally think of at the end of the war, comes later. But it's signed by Germany and the Allied powers. So I want to show you this kind of graphic here to show you that World War I changed the world, and here's why. So it shows you the casualties of the Central Powers in this top graphic on the left here, the amount dead, the amount wounded, the total, etc., and then World War I casualties of the Allied powers. And you see down at the bottom that even though there were a ton more of the Allies, they had a little over 1 million more dead. But looking at over here on the right, Russia definitely led the way, then Germany and France, and then we kind of go down the list. But a total of 7.5 million people were killed in the First World War. And so we the world had never seen something like this before. And so to say that what came after the World War, the First World War, was just as important as the war itself is an understatement, right? Like how we resolved peace from this catastrophic event is super important, and hence why you need to understand it better than the war itself. So the war is over, like I said, November 11th, 1918, and January 18th, 1919, a conference began to set the terms for peace after the war. This is called the Paris Peace Conference, where 32 countries attended. Okay, so this is the Palace of Versailles, or of Versailles is how you say it here, is where the conference was held, which was in Paris. We have Clemenceau of France. We have David Lloyd George of England, Orlando of Italy, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. This is considered the Big Four. These are the Big Four leaders that were at the Paris Peace Conference kind of coming to this agreement. And this quote is ever so important because it really speaks to, again, why we need to understand not the war itself, although that's not a bad understanding to have, but to understand the result, because it's much easier to make war than to make peace. And so the peace treaty process after the war that was so complicated is really important for us to understand, because I mean, wouldn't you rather understand how to come to peace than to war, right? So just kind of going along with those themes. Okay, so Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States at the time, came up with a plan for a fair and lasting peace, and he called it his 14 points. So this is where he listed 14 things he believed would bring long-term peace, okay? And no, you don't have to understand each one of the 14, okay? But you do need to understand kind of some categories. So his ideas included these 4 big categories: an end to secret treaties. Like, we can't be all like backstabbing and be all secretive, right? We need to have it be transparent, have it all out in the open. Freedom of the seas. So we had this huge buildup of the Navy leading up to and during World War I, and so we need to not have so much kind of competition and arguing over the international waterways, right? Free trade was huge. And then finally, this idea of self-determination. He was a big advocate of this, and that letting countries decide their own government and then gain independence. We can't just all be a bunch of colonizers and where we're taking over a bunch of countries. Those countries need to speak for themselves, and that's self-determination. So then keeping the peace, or the 14th point. So again, he has 14th point. Knowing those 4 big categories is huge, but then the 14th point of the 14 is super important, because this is where he proposed what he called the League of Nations. Again, this is the 14th point. It's a general association of nations that would protect great and small states alike. Okay, so it had this idea of collective security, kind of like a squad, right? If you mess with me, you're going to get my homies, right? Like, these people, these countries have my back. So it reflected the United States' hope that in the future, conflicts would be solved peacefully without war, right? So this is one of those key understandings in that we're talking about peace here, and not just peace for right now, but how to avoid war in the future. So Wilson was all about this. I mean, he wrote like hundreds of pages or something like that for his League of Nations with the 14 points. But here's the thing, and this political cartoon shows it well. So you could say this is kind of the United States, or this is Wilson marrying foreign entanglements, right? And this is the United States Congress bursting in to break up the marriage. Speak now or forever hold your peace, right? So they're breaking in. Congress actually rejects the League of Nations. And this is where we see the start of U.S. isolationism. So what is isolationism? Because that's one of your objectives. You got to be able to define it. So it's staying out of international alliances and affairs. So isolation, think of isolation. You're staying like either in your home or in a small place, like, right, you're not involving yourself with other people necessarily or other groups. So it's a focus on things happening inside the country rather than internationally or with foreign countries and alliances and that kind of thing. So we have the Treaty of Versailles, which is the final peace settlement between Germany and the Allies, and it was determined at that Paris Peace Conference, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And here's the thing, though, Woodrow Wilson and the Big Four were like pretty much big advocates of this, and the world was like waiting to see this peace treaty go through that then included some of the League of Nations. Well, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify it. Their opposition dealt with collective security in the League of Nations. That's where their kind of animosity and their problem lied. Senators were afraid they could get easily dragged into another country's conflict too easily. They didn't want war again, right? So they thought, we need to not tie ourselves or obligate ourselves to get involved in other people's drama. So why would we sign this? Because that's what this piece of paper is going to do. It's going to obligate us by law to get involved. Article X, this is a part where it required members of the League of Nations to come to the aid of other nations in the League when they were attacked. And this is the big thing that the U.S. Senate refused to say okay to. So we have Wilson's 14 points, right? It's kind of like a rough draft of the Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty, where he includes his League of Nations, right? That's the 14th point. And then that was then included in, so the League of Nations was then included in the Treaty of Versailles, which is that final peace treaty between Germany, the main central power, right, and all the allies. Well, the Senate said, we didn't like your League of Nations before it was in the Treaty of Versailles, and now that it is in the Treaty of Versailles, including other things, we don't like that either. So the Senate actually rejected both of these things. So we have our president, Woodrow Wilson, over in Paris with all of these huge powers, right? The Big Four and 32 countries attending. And he's kind of in control. They're kind of looking to the United States for some guidance because we rose as a very large power, world power at the time, and we essentially sealed the deal on finishing the war. And Woodrow Wilson spoke a big game about peace and how to get there, but then at home, he's got a ton of issues going on, and Congress says, nope, not doing it. So another part of this whole isolationism thing and dealing with the end of the war that you need to understand, other than the Paris Peace Conference and Treaty of Versailles, League of Nations, is the Washington Naval Conference. This was in 1921. So in the wake of World War I, leaders in the international community, right, because we're now a globe, we're not just separate countries, because we all have a navy where we have tons of ships and we're all kind of intermingling now, the world is our playground, not just our country. They sought to prevent the possibility of another war because we're coming into contact with each other more, and that makes beef, right? That makes drama. So between 21 and 22, the world's largest naval powers gathered in Washington for a conference where they discussed naval disarmament, right? Think of arms as the right to bear arms, right? Disarmament, so getting rid of all of the military power, essentially, and ways to relieve growing tensions in East Asia, which was the biggest concern. And according to the United States, Japan was the biggest concern because they were such a growing power at the time. So we actually have 4 things that arise out of this. We have 3 power treaties, and then the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which we'll talk about as well. So the 4-power treaty was between 4 powers, right? We're going to talk more about these, but you really should, in some space in your notes, jot down and listen to what I'm saying, right? So listen here, pause, and then write, and rewind if you need to. So this was the U.S., France, the UK, United Kingdom, and Japan. They agreed to consult with each other in the event of a future crisis in East Asia before taking action. Okay, so the 4-power treaty were those 4 powers, and it was essentially about any future crisis that could arise in East Asia, and that they agreed we will talk about it, right? We're gonna discuss and consult before we take action. The 5-power treaty was signed by the U.S., UK, Japan, France, and then Italy. So the first 4 plus Italy. And it was the cornerstone of the naval disarmament at this time, right? The reducing of military forces. It called for each of the countries involved to maintain a set ratio of warships, essentially, and kind of holding each country to a certain number, and that you can't go above that because then you're getting too powerful. And then we have the 9-power treaty. This marked the internationalization of the U.S. open door policy in China. So back in, I believe it was the first set of notes, video 1 for Unit 4, we talked about what are the open door notes. What's the open door policy? As a quick reminder, this was the U.S. saying, hey, everyone, all you European powers that are trading in China, we need to keep the market open. You can't just like have a monopoly, essentially. You can't just control one of the trade markets in China. So the 9-power treaty promised that each of the countries signing, which included 9 of them, would respect the territorial integrity, the independence of China. So no one's going to colonize and control China and their trade markets. Finally, the Kellogg-Briand Pact was the treaty between the U.S. and other powers, providing for the rejection of war as an instrument of national policy, and that we are not going to revert to war again, right? We're going to talk with each other and make sure that we are not going to do this all over again, because 7.5 million people dead is just not worth it. So at this point, go ahead and stop. Make sure you answer those summary questions and get a stamp. And have a great day.